lovely people, I'm back with another book chat in the wrap-up of stuff I've read at some point in my past. I have loads of things to talk about. I'm going to dive in because my camera battery is dying and I don't want to lose it. I'm going to kick things off by talking about the top book in this review. There's A Clash of Steel by C.B. Lee, which is a Treasure Island remix. This joins Black Sails in the Treasure Island remixes that have my whole heart club. Also joins it in the Treasure Island remixes that are deeply queer club. Black Sails is one of my favourite TV shows of all time. It's riffing off of Treasure Island. So when I saw that this was riffing off of Treasure Island, I was like, got to do it. I loved this so much. This is set in 1826, and we follow Shang, who is, she's been raised in this quiet little village, and her mother only comes to visit every now and then, but she manages to convince her mother that she is ready to take on more responsibilities. So her mother takes her to the city, and then essentially, like, shenanigans ensue. They find this, like, she realizes she, in her locket, has always had this, like, key clues where this legendary treasure was buried by this gigantic pirate queen. Gigantic? I just mean that she was very successful, not that she was really big. And then she essentially, like, steals away on a ship to go find the treasure. So far, very Treasure Island. What I loved about this is I loved everything about this, to be honest with you. This was a 5-star read for me. So, the world building, the descriptions of place in this, amazing. Specifically the descriptions of food. I was so hungry reading all of this when they're in the city, when they're on the boats. Like, the food descriptions were incredible, but so were the place descriptions. Every single place we go to, I felt rooted in it and I understood it. The crew of this ship that she ends up on, it is heartbreaking because you are reading it and you are like, Treasure Island knowledge. At some point, surely there's going to be, like, betrayal, and yet I love every single crew member utterly and deeply. The depth of familial relationships here. Shang has such a complex relationship with her mother, so does her love interest with her mother. The love interest, how that relationship grows. Just, I loved so much about this. The way history is interweaved with this, with Zhongyi and all of that history interspersed with the Treasure Island elements, interspersed with, you learn history of, for example, like Vietnam, stuff like this, like the way that real history is interweaved with this fictional narrative, the depths of emotion and bonds that are explored. I just had the most fun. When you already know what plot beats a story will have, because it is riffing off of a story that you have read before that is a classic, I think it is a show of good writing when you still feel that level of tenseness and that sense of what's going to happen. I'm so torn. Like, when betrayals happened, I felt them in my soul. I just loved this deeply, and I would highly recommend it. And I need to read more C.B. Lee, because this is my first C.B. Lee book. It was beautiful, it was queer, it was adventurous, it was wonderful. Moving on to a reread. This is The Hourglass Factory by Lucy Ribchester. Sometimes I have books on my shelves that I remember enjoying, but I don't really remember why, and I don't want to get rid of them in case I do still like them, so I'm slowly rereading them and reassessing my shelves. This is one such book. I gave this a 4 stars when I first read it. I gave it a 2 stars on this reread. I understand why I liked this. This is doing a lot of things, but also that's kind of why I didn't like it this time. So, Ebony Diamond is this trapeze artist, a suffragette, and there's trouble and she's deeply involved. We follow Frankie George, who is a female news reporter who is, like, trying to get the scoop, and she's trying to essentially find Ebony Diamond, talk to her. A woman's been murdered who was mistaken for Ebony Diamond, so, like, someone's after her. It's just, we spend a whole lot of this book trying to find Ebony Diamond, but then also so many other threads at play at all times. I think potentially if there had just been fewer things going on, that might have been good, because we are trying to find Ebony Diamond throughout the whole thing, but then there's, like, here's a thread, here's a thread, here's a thread, and I just at times didn't feel like all of these threads added stuff. It's a bit of a chunker, so I was like, could we have not just taken some of it away? Also, bearing in mind it is focused on the suffragettes, I felt like we didn't really get that big a focus on the suffragettes. And also, finally, this absolutely should have been gay, and the fact that it wasn't is a travesty. So that's all I'm going to say on this one. I probably reviewed this when I initially read it. It's probably on my channel somewhere. I think I felt like there was so much going on, and I felt like if there had been less going on, it could have been executed in a way where all of the things were better. Another book that gave me somewhat mixed feelings is Blameless by Gail Carriger, which is the third book in the Parasol Protectorate series. I just reviewed the second book in my last book chat, and I said that there was an event at the end that the handling of would influence how much I like this series. I'm a bit disappointed by the handling of it, to be honest with you. The main plot of this I can't really talk about because there's a massive spoiler to do with the end of the second book. Essentially, our main character Alexia finds herself a bit of an outcast in society, so she decides that she is going to leave and go to the continent because also people are trying to kill her. She is a soulless, which means that she has the ability to negate vampires and werewolves and turn them back into humans for as long as she is touching them, which makes her a controversial figure in this Victorian society that has learnt to live with supernaturals and that actually they can be quite powerful in. What I found difficult about this is that the whole book for me hinged on how well this thing that happened at the end of the second book would be handled, and we spend the whole book like going through, and then right at the end is when these two figures meet again, and I just felt like it wasn't handled like it should have been. Like I don't like one of the characters who's involved anyway. They somehow got worse in this novel for me, because the whole book they spend moping when they're the person who's in the wrong, and then right at the end when you're like, okay, now is your time to grovel, now is your time to like have some conversations about this thing, it's just so quickly resolved, and I don't think that's fair. For something that you have spun out for a whole book, I found that so anticlimactic. So that is what my main point of disappointment is. My other critique actually would be that Alexia goes to the continent and she has some fabulous adventures. I enjoyed travelling around France and around Italy, expanding this worldview a bit, seeing the presence of supernaturals in other countries that is different to how they are in England. That was really fab. It's just, she's travelling around for the purpose of finding out this information, but simultaneously someone who is still in London also finds out the same information. And to me, that kind of feels like it sort of negates the point of her going. I know she had to leave because she was being a bit of an outcast and people were trying to kill her. It's just, people were still trying to kill her when she was on the continent, so did you gain that much from going on this adventure? Discuss. On that said, I don't want it to sound like I didn't enjoy this, because I did have a fun time. The lesbian inventor has a much bigger role in this, which I enjoyed because she's one of my favourite characters. Ivy was much better in this than the second book, actually. I didn't say in my review, but I felt like in the second book, Ivy was, there's no nice way of saying this, just portrayed as being so incredibly stupid in a way that I found, like, a little bit disrespectful to a person, because, like, the way that Alexia talked about her, I was like, why are you friends if this is how you talk about each other? But also, like, B just felt like it was there to make plot things happen, whereas in this one, actually, she's more intelligent, and she might seem a bit ditzy, but that doesn't mean she's not got an idea of what's going on, and that she's not astute enough to pass on information when needed. So I much appreciated the portrayal of Ivy. I also read on my Kindle Monstrous Design by Dunn, which is the second book in, I don't actually know what that series is called, but I talked about the first book in last book chat. I also really liked Monstrous Design. I didn't like Monstrous Design as much as Dangerous Remedy. This is like a historical series that is set in revolutionary France, and in this second book, half of our characters have gone to England, and I felt the lack of the French Revolution setting in those portions. I felt like that was one of my favourite things of the first book, so obviously I felt the lack of it, but also I just felt like the characterisation, the world building of those portions just didn't really feel as strong or as interesting to me. Definitely the portions that were back in revolutionary France I found much more engaging. That's my personal preference, but also I just think because our characters are split, some character plot lines got to be more interesting than others. I will say, Al was a character in the first book who I was not really bothered about. I felt like he was probably the member of the battalion that I cared the least about. In this one of my faves, absolute character, like, not growth, but he just gets to shine more in a way that is sad, because it is kind of related to some bad stuff that happened in the first book, but you just get a better sense of him. And I felt like you get a better sense of the whole battalion, actually. I think in the first book it is a lot about Camille, because she is the main woman, she's our main character, but this one you got a lot more depth to the rest of the battalion, which I really appreciated. Ada has you know, Ada and Camille are separated, so it's interesting to have two love interests who are separated to still, like, see if you root for them. Ada has much more, like, moral, complex decisions and difficulties that she has to explore, and I think that's something I like about this series as a whole. It really delves into, like, moral murkiness. This one has real, like, Frankenstein vibes at its heart, which was really interesting, and lends itself to this discussion of what is moral, how far do you go, how far do you compromise yourself for a cause, all of these discussions. I just think one of my favourite things about this series is that it is a really fun YA series, that this one has less heist than the first one did. This one has a lot more, like, they're trying to find Olymp, their friend, and then there are these, like, Frankenstein elements, and there's much more of, like, there's, like, the villains have much more presence, but at all times, like, we are still exploring, like, the power of choice and decision making, but we're also looking at, like, sometimes you have to compromise. How far are you willing to compromise? All of these kinds of things. I just actually think it's a really exciting YA series, and I'm really looking forward to reading the final book in the series when it's released. To end on some non-fiction, I have The Ravenmaster, My Life with the Ravens at the Tower of London by Christopher Skaife. Christopher Skaife is also known as the Ravenmaster. He looks after the ravens at the Tower of London. This is very much like a compendium, so I think the parts I found most interesting in this were when he was just talking about what his job entails, like, what does looking after the ravens entail? What does that mean? What does he do? What's it like living in the Tower of London all the time? Like, you're literally living in a tourist place. It was really interesting, actually. He also, like, talks a lot just about ravens in general, like, from, like, a bird point of view, from a cultural point of view, like, to do with history, to do with, like, a superstition, kind of stuff like this. I think that side of it, like, I do know a bit about ravens already, so a lot of the stuff that was just about, like, ravens are really big, you don't understand how big a raven is until you see one. I'm like, yeah, I know, I've seen them. That kind of thing. This was a very, very light read. I read it, like, just in a day while it was, like, there was lots of rugby on. I was dipping in and out. I had a nice time reading it. And the final book I want to talk about was another book I read on my Kindle, and that was Natives by Akala. This is looking at race and class in Britain. I thought that this was immensely well written. I think Akala does kind of what I felt like Benjamin Zephaniah did in his autobiography, where they're able to take these, like, huge complex topics but talk about them in a way that is, like, really accessible, and you know, they deal with nuance. Their, like, language is always really easy to understand. You get a lot out of this whether you are new to reading these kinds of books or if you have already read a lot of them already. I think that there is stuff to be gained from this. It's not introductory, but it does give you enough context that if you haven't read anything like this before, you can connect. I think partly that has to do with the fact that he roots you in his own experiences and then he expands from there, and I think that's a really useful way of doing it. So he roots you in his own experiences of growing up black in Britain and what that meant to him, and then he takes individual anecdotes of things that have happened to him, and then he goes beyond that and looks at it from, like, zoomed out level. And I just think that rooting things in personal experiences and then taking them out larger is such a great way of helping you see the human aspect of things and not just these things as abstract topics. You get to see the way that they affect real people. He covers loads of things. He covers, like, policing, he covers education, he covers, like, identity. He explores a lot of topics and kind of examines the way that I think British people, we get squeamish about talking about some of these things. There's sort of, like, this, like, cultural idea that we shouldn't, like, talk about these things, or that we shouldn't look at it too hard, or that, like, these things happen in America but they don't happen over here, where it's like, actually, yes, we have, like, a really long history of, like, racism, police brutality, all these kind of things. Like, they absolutely still happen over here, and it's something we need to look at, and it's something we need to acknowledge and understand, because we can't stop them if we pretend like they never happen. So definitely a book I would recommend. And that's everything I wanted to talk about in this week's wrap-up. I would love to hear if you've read any of them. If you have any thoughts on them, please do leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I will see you next time for something different.